You are listening to the Examine Life with Bram Levinson. So I think it's about time that I talked about yoga. And more specifically, my experience with yoga, my life in yoga, yoga in my life. For some reason, I find myself a little bit nervous talking about this because for me, yoga has been insanely, intensely personal. And it's rare that I talk about my yoga practice or my experience with yoga. It's rare that I talk about what it means to me and my relationship to it, the way we dance around each other, sometimes coming together, sometimes being very far apart. People tend to assume that because I teach yoga, I practice yoga every day, and that could not be further from the truth. And when I say yoga, I'm talking the asana practice, the yoga asana, the postures of yoga. I started practicing yoga in 1999, and the sort of backstory to that is that I had been going to the gym for exercise, for physical well being, and I hated the gym so much. I despised the lighting. I really, the music that they played there drove me nuts. And I couldn't reconcile myself with the endless posturing that I was seeing. These people who were walking around literally looking like they were puffed up. And not because of their muscles were big, but because they were adopting, or what I then interpreted it as being them adopting some sort of, I don't know, posture, peacocking, for lack of a better term. Just walking around sort of with no movement in the hips, not natural. It felt like nobody was being authentic. And I did it for, I don't know, 6 months, which for me then was a record. And then I decided, you know what, I'm done. I'm done with this. But I needed something physical to do. I didn't really have an understanding of why I needed something physical to do, but I just knew that I needed to move my body. I needed to have some sort of physical practice. And so I remember going home after work one day, and I came home and I pulled out the yellow pages, the telephone book, and I opened the yellow pages and I just looked up yoga. And right in front of me on the page, I found a woman who was a yoga teacher. She was teaching yoga out of her home, and she was directly across the street from me. So my address was 964, her address was 987. And so I contacted her, not immediately, but I contacted her eventually. And she told me that she taught yoga in sessions, that you would pay for, let's say, an 8-week session in, 8 classes, one a week. And that was the gig. And she didn't really give me too much information about the practice or about her style. But I was curious and I wanted to know about it. And I had heard about yoga sort of through word of mouth, and sometimes in the media I would see Madonna practicing yoga, and I saw that she was jacked, and I thought, wow, that looks like it's pretty physical. That looks like something I might want to do. And so I basically just contacted this woman, Joan Ravinsky, and I registered for a session. And I went over to her place one evening for class, and she held classes in this like double parlor. You came into her house, it was like a traditional gray stone, and you walked up the stairs into her home, and there was a small little vestibule, and then you walked into it, and right on the right was this double room, separated in the middle of the room by this beautiful like archway, or this archway, this like moldings and pillars. It was lovely. But it was really one big room that sort of looked like a double room simply because of that partition in the middle. But it wasn't a full partition. It was just along the edges, the pillars and whatever. And she had these bolts of carpet for yoga mats. And, I grabbed a bolt of carpet and I brought it down to the back of the room, and I lay down and I followed her instruction for the hour. And it was very, very slow, and it was very, very gentle. And listen, I had no idea what I was doing, and I was hyper aware that I had no idea what I was doing. And I spent most of the time looking around at everybody else who seemed to know what they were doing. And followed. I mimicked. There wasn't a massively important emphasis on the breathing. It was just take the poses and I guess sort of sink into this atmosphere that there was in that room and that was an extension of Joan herself. And it was just this very quiet and calm energy, this vibration that is actually very similar to the energy that I feel right now as I record this. You know, I'm in my little closet recording area. It's very muffled and it's very quiet. And that's what it was like. I remember she would have the overhead lights on but dimmed. They were dimmed down to sort of like a golden glow. And in the back of the room, in one corner of the room, was this little table, a little altar with a statue of Nataraja, so dancing Shiva, with a little candle that was lit. And we moved. We moved for, I want to say, an hour and a half. And at the end of it, she brought us into this pose where she just said, lie down and let yourself relax. And she described it as being corpse pose and Shavasana. And she then started to guide us through a body sensing meditation where she would name parts of the body, and we were meant to locate that part of the body in our own body and just notice if there was any sensation that arose there. And she would continue to guide us through, allowing us to rotate attention throughout the body. I had never done anything like this before. I had no idea what I was doing, to be completely honest. And at the end of it, at the end of the class, all I remember is I got up and I felt high. I felt like I was high on drugs. And I didn't know why. And I couldn't really verbalize what the class had been, because there were parts of it I didn't remember. But I felt incredible. I felt this sense of like peace and this sense of like everything's okay, that kind of thing. And so I came back. And I came back and I came back. And I would go with a friend of mine who I worked with, and she became sort of my yoga buddy. And she's still a very close friend of mine and still plays a massive role in my life. And for years, we went to Joan's for yoga. And Joan became, for me, probably one of the most important players in the theater piece of this life, the Brahm life, my understanding of life. I didn't know it back then. Back then, I found her very unassuming and quiet and polite and funny, with a really sharp wit when she would, let me see it. But nonetheless, I knew that I would come into these classes and I would get on the mat. And, initially when I started practicing, I thought that I needed to be living up to some sort of expectation I had of yoga. And actually, I didn't even know what yoga was before that first class. I knew when I was a kid, when I was really young in elementary school, I had a friend whose mother did yoga. She practiced yoga. And I don't know how I knew that. I think maybe he told me, or maybe when I was over at his house, I would see yoga books or yoga video cassettes. And I remember once we went to go watch television in his mother's room, and in front of the TV, she had this little mini trampoline. So obviously, in hindsight, I understand she was probably doing some 80s workout video that involved a trampoline, like jumping up and down and twisting and whatever. But in the moment, when I, first started thinking, okay, I'm going to practice yoga, and I found Joan in the Yellow Pages, or at least I found Joan's telephone number in the Yellow Pages, I remember thinking back to my friend's mom and thinking, I think yoga has something to do with the trampoline. So despite that, I didn't have any expectations when I walked into Joan's place. It wasn't like I was looking for the trampoline, but that was in the back of my mind. But when I would go into classes, even a year, 2 years into it, I still wasn't quite sure about what the structure of what I was doing was. I didn't understand the mechanics of it. I just knew that if I went in and I followed the instruction, I would feel better. And I had this preconceived notion that I had to go in and be hyper rigid, that I had to go in and pay attention and everything had to be done perfectly. And I couldn't pay attention to whatever my internal voice was telling me. So if I had thoughts that were coming up, those thoughts were meant to be ignored, as far as I understood. And what ended up happening was the thoughts would get louder and louder and louder until I couldn't ignore them. And class for me, at a certain point in my practice, maybe let's say a year and a half to 2 years into it, became the practice of following Joan's instruction and getting into the poses and breathing deeper into the poses to relax into them, while still being very, very aware of what my thoughts were, of what was going on in my mind, and where, certain sensations in the body were, and ultimately emotions that were coming up. And what I at first tried to disregard or not pay attention to, I then just started to welcome, because trying to fight it was more work than just letting it in while still doing the rest of the practice. And what I began to realize was that the yoga practice, when I got on my mat and got into that room where everything was set up for just total peace to happen, then I could be with all those thoughts would start to come up, and all those emotions would start to come up. And this was a period in my life that I think I was kind of lost in. I did not know what I wanted to do with my life. I was in a career already, but I didn't respect what I was doing for work. And consequently, I didn't attribute any value to the money I was making, because what I was experiencing in that moment was that if you don't respect the way you earn it, money has no value. And so I was earning money, I was earning good money, but I had absolutely no respect for the work I was doing, because for me it wasn't a job, it wasn't a legit career. And therefore, the money that I was making from it, I was irresponsible with. I spent quickly, I got all my, how can I put this? I tied up all the ends that needed to be tied up, but I wasn't very responsible with money. I wasn't giving it any significance or meaning. And so I would find myself in this practice, in this beautifully lit double room, in this just ambiance of beauty and peace and hushed and quiet. And I would just start to observe. I would start to observe what was coming up in my mind, and I would start to observe what was coming up in my body, and I would start to observe the sensations associated to emotions that were coming up. And if the thoughts were about, how I was so unsure of what the future held, then I noticed what came up as a result of that. And I would love to say that I didn't personalize it, but I did. Back then I did. It was all very influential on my being. And I believed it was all true. And so if worry came up, I was worried on the mat. And if annoyance came up, I was annoyed on the mat. And if impatience came up, I was impatient on the mat. And by the end of the class, and this happened actually quite early on, but at the end of the class, I would get off the mat and I would just feel better. I just felt so much better. And all I knew was that if I did this practice, I would feel better at the end of it. As I started to age, as I started to grow a little bit older and life started to happen, there were moments where I stopped going to class. I remember in 2001, there were a couple of things that occurred. Life was just happening. Life was happening and things were getting very difficult. And I was dealing with loss, people dying, players in my life. I was dealing with just the uncertainty of who I was and what I was supposed to be doing in the world. And I remember whenever something would come up in my life, whenever more drama would occur, I would contact Joan and say, look, I know I've paid for the session, but I'm not going to make it for the rest of it. Don't worry about the money, keep the money, but I just can't make it. And this happened a few times over a few years. And every time she was amazing. Every time she understood and she held that for me and, told me that she hoped things would get better soon. And then one day when I phoned her to let her know that this was again occurring, something else had happened, she said to me, listen, I totally hear you and I hope that everything sort of turns around. I want you to consider that when things get like this, that's when you need the practice most. That's not when you move away from the practice. It's when you actually need the practice most. And I remember in that moment, I felt so fragile, and I felt like if I took anything else on that I didn't have to do, like go to work and earn money, I was going to crush under the weight of it. So I thanked her, and I heard her, but I didn't assimilate what she was saying. I only learned that years later. But ultimately, what she taught me was that the practice is there to deal with the ups and the downs of life in order to find some sort of common middle ground, some equanimity, for lack of a better term, some neutrality, some perspective where you can see, or I could see, all of the extremes that were occurring in my life and not necessarily give them more meaning than they deserved, and not buy into them, and not let them define that part of my journey of life. It was an incredibly valuable and incredibly significant teaching, what she gave me. And so throughout, I'd say, 1999 to let's say 2019, let's say 2016. So let's say over 17 years, my relationship with yoga itself, I would be very, very into it, and then I would move away from it, and I would come back to it, and then move away from it. And I remember Joan telling me way back then that was the path. That was the path with yoga. That was the path with everything. That nothing was ever one thing. That nothing was ever a constant. That it was a dance. So all I knew was that yoga pretty much saved my life. And then in 2008, I decided that I couldn't do what I had been doing for a career, for a job anymore. I couldn't handle it. I didn't want to do it anymore. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but that wasn't it. I wasn't going to do that anymore. And I remember my partner and I went to Greece in 2008. And before I left, I had really been considering quitting my job without knowing what the next stages would be in life. I didn't have a university degree to fall back on. I didn't have any specific trade training. And so I had no idea what I would do if I left this career. And so and by the way, I was not a spiritual person at all. I didn't believe in God. I didn't have a relationship to God. I found that religion just separated people. My experience with religion growing up as a child was that I would go to synagogue, a place that was supposed to be a hub for spirituality and connection to something bigger than you, and all I saw were a bunch of superficial people in their, Saturday best, for lack of a better term, talking about the shit they owned, the things they were doing, the trips they were taking, and I just found it all so silly. And so all I knew was that I didn't want that. I didn't want to be in a relationship with anything that was bigger than me, that wasn't taken seriously. And so before we went to Greece in 2008, I decided that I was going to, give up my angst and my uncertainty about what I should do to whatever was listening, whatever God thing would be listening. And so I remember I just sort of gave it up to God. I remember that's what I thought I was doing. I gave it up to God, and I said, look, if this is what I'm supposed to do, if I'm supposed to leave this job, because listen, I had security, right? Everything that we're told contributes to the security that our culture prioritizes and elevates. I had. And so to leave that was a huge risk. And so I basically just said to whatever I thought God might be, I just said, look, if I'm supposed to leave, I need a sign. You need to send me a sign, and it needs to be irrefutably a sign. Cut to, 9-10 days later, I'm in Greece, and I am dreaming about work, and it's unpleasant. I remember it was an unpleasant dream, and all of a sudden in my left ear, there was a male voice that said to me, you just have to leave. And I woke up. Immediately I woke up. And I said, okay. I said to myself, you got it. You got your sign. You have to go home and quit. You don't know what else is going to come, but you know that you got your sign. So, you asked for the sign. You've now got to do your part of the work. So the next night, the same thing happened. I heard the voice again. And I said, okay, I got it. Like I understood it. I've heard it. I'm going to act on it. And I came home, a week later, and I quit my job. I didn't know what I was going to do. And a couple of months prior to this happening, a friend of mine, one of my closest friends, had brought me to a yoga studio in Montreal. And I had been really, really afraid to go to another yoga studio because my practice with Joan, first of all, was so personal. For me, it was so personal. And Joan was my teacher, and the style that she was teaching, which was basically a very, 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 very slow hatha class with some body sensing thrown in. That was the practice I knew. And the studio that my friend wanted to bring me to was a vinyasa practice. It was an Ashtanga-based Jivamukti practice, actually. And I was petrified. I was vulnerable. I didn't know what I was going to be getting myself into. I didn't want to look stupid. It was basically like the whole experience with Joan coming back up again 9 years later. Long story short, I went to this new studio and immediately fell in love. I fell in love with the energy at Luna Yoga in Montreal. I fell in love with Jen Magandance, who has become one of my good friends as well. She's the co-owner with her husband, Jason Kent. And basically, I just fell in love with the studio. But I also got very close to Jen at that time. And so I came back from Greece and quit my job. And then I went out with Jen for dinner one night. And I told her that I didn't know what I was going to do, that I was really at an odd part of my journey, and it was uncertain, and the way forward was very unclear. And she looked at me and she said, look, if you could do anything, if money wasn't an issue, and if geography wasn't an issue, and if education wasn't an issue, then what would you do? And I looked at her and I said, well, I would teach yoga and I would write. And she looked at me and she just shrugged her shoulders as if to say, well, okay, so why not do those? And I remember just thinking, oh my God, like, where do I even start? And she was amazing because she basically just said to me, look, find a yoga teacher training. Start shopping around for yoga teacher training. See which teachers resonate with you, which practices resonate with you. And again, this was me coming out of my comfort zone because not only had I just making a leap going from Joan's teachings to Jen's teachings, but then I was being told, okay, well, now you got to find another teacher. You got to find another studio that offers teacher trainings. And in terms of the writing, I just took the initiative to start emailing online magazine editors blindly and just saying, look, like, I want to write. Please give me a chance to write. And some of them got back. Most of them basically declined my offer. One of those did not. One person did not. And she gave me a job, and I started writing. And she became one of my closest friends as well. Her daughter is my goddaughter today. And, everything that happened, it was such like a breeding ground for beauty and creativity and newness in those days because it was all uncertain. But all of those steps I was taking, all of those risks I was taking were beautiful. And they really, they taught me that risk is beautiful, that to jump beyond yourself is beautiful. So to make a very long story short, I started a yoga teacher training. It was an Ashtanga yoga teacher training, and it almost broke me. It was very grueling. And, while I was doing that training, a couple of months into it, Jen had taken me on as manager at the studio, so I was working. And when things seemed slow at the studio, she would pull me into the studio itself, and she would say, okay, you know what, let's do some one-on-one training. I want you to teach me like I'm one person. Teach me yoga as if I'm one person. This is a private class. So she gave me pointers, and then she would pull me in on another day and say, teach me like I am 40 people. And then another day she would say, teach me like I'm 3 people. And she gave me an education, a training that I could never have gotten anywhere else. It was unbelievable. But I was getting that training simultaneously to the other training I was doing in Ashtanga. And I was writing. And listen, at that point in my life, all I wanted was to be able to pay my mortgage. I was adamant that I was not going to, first of all, I was not going to fail at the yoga and the writing. There was no plan B. I could not stop doing them and give up. That was not an option. I also said to myself, I will pay my way through life. I am not going to pay any less into the business of my life with my partner than I have been. I will pay my part of the mortgage. I have to earn this money. And I did. It all sort of just happened. And it happened because I was working my ass off and I did my part of it, which typically what I've learned now opens up the pathways to everything else. But I cannot tell you how much it meant to me to have Jen just open that door for me and show me not only what was possible, but what I was capable of doing. So since then, things have gotten much bigger than I ever thought they would get. The yoga grew and grew and grew, and it led to other things. It led to studying and teaching meditation. It led to me giving up the rigidity I had in teaching initially, where I would write down the entire class on a piece of paper and then stick to the class I had written to, that I had written out rather, and make sure that I adhered to that structure, and that I remembered what poses came after which poses. Because there was one day where I had done that, and I would keep the paper with all of the poses with the class written out on one side of the studio. And one day I was teaching, and I wasn't on that side of the studio, and I forgot where I was in the class. I forgot what the next pose was supposed to be. And so, all of a sudden I realized, look, I know what the structure of the class is. I know what poses fall into this part of the structure. Just wing it. And it was when I started winging it, something bigger happened. All of a sudden, it wasn't about me controlling. It was about something moving through me. And all of a sudden, things started to come out of my mouth that had very little to do with the yoga practice itself, and had way more to do with life and how we're living, and the experience of being alive, and of being fallible, and being vulnerable, and being emotional. All of it all just started to happen. And everything grew, everything snowballed, and huge opportunities came my way, and I took them even when I didn't know what the fuck I was doing, and I just figured, look, I will figure it out. And every single time I did. Every time. And I don't take credit for that. The only thing I take credit for is allowing myself to be in the geographical locations and the environments that were energetically conducive to that, whatever that thing was that was working through me, to work through me. I know now that there's an expression, there's an intelligence in every single one of us that is begging to be expressed. That's what this whole journey of life is about. It's about self-realization and allowing that expression, which is unique and should not be a clone of any other expression, to be expressed, to be let out into the world. So great things have happened. I have to admit that my relationship with yoga itself has been very much of a love-hate relationship, and I'll tell you why. My physical practice, as a kid, I was a gymnast, and I was never very flexible, which is why I loved yoga when I first came to it in 1999, because it helped me improve my flexibility. However, when you go into a yoga group class environment, you are being exposed to people, many of whom are dancers and many of whom are just naturally flexible, but you're being exposed to people who have got what I used to refer to as the Yoga Journal practice. Every pose is exactly the way it looks in Yoga Journal. Every pose looks effortless. There's no sweat. It just looks like, it's like I'm just doing this. I'm doing something else. It's no different from me walking down the street. That was not my practice. When I got on the mat, would be struggling to, number one, struggling to relax, but struggling to get into the positions themselves. And this is something that has obviously gotten much better throughout the years, but I still don't have that perfect yoga proportionate body, and I don't, or proportional body, and I also don't have what I used to consider to be the perfect yoga practice. And so I would be horribly insecure when I would go into a group environment, because I knew that I was being judged by the people around me. Now, whether I was being judged because I came in with that chip on my shoulder, or whether I was being judged regardless of that chip on my shoulder, I knew that I was being judged by it, and I was being judged by it. And I really resented the fact that the yoga environment was supposed to be, in my mind, a safe space for anybody to come in with any practice. It doesn't matter if you were missing limbs. You would come into that practice and you would do your practice, and it didn't matter what you looked like, and it didn't matter what you were capable of or not. It was your intention and your presence and your commitment and your breathing. And because I have been judged throughout the years, and I mean, I can name names, I'm not going to, but I could name the names of people who have either treated me differently when they saw my yoga practice, or have made comments to me, not necessarily degrading comments, but comments about like, you know, should you be a yoga teacher, that kind of thing, because, you know, your practice isn't perfect. And my response has always been like, you might want to forget about what yoga looks like on a mat and understand what it looks like in the world. Because if you're a yoga person and you're going out into the world making comment like that, you might want to check yourself. You might want to wake up to the trauma that you are inflicting by making a comment like that. All I know is that my yoga practice is very, very, very personal. And it may, in some poses, be photogenic at this point. It may not be in other poses. I don't care. I don't care. I don't want to be one of those people who judged me based on it and made me feel so shitty about myself. So my relationship with yoga has always been very much of a love-hate thing. And it was not initially. Initially, it was very, very pure, and Joan welcomed all of it. It was when I got into different environments, when I started to go to different group classes and meet different yogis and yoginis. And listen, I understand that all of it is just an expression of consciousness. All of it is just an expression of life happening, that people are just reflecting back to me different aspects of life. And really, my work was to not personalize it, to not internalize it, to not identify with all of that. But listen, I am also a work in progress, and I was a work in progress back then. And it was very difficult for me to not take it personally. I knew what my physical limitations were. It didn't stop me from going into those environments and doing the trainings that I've done and getting the education. But if anything, it taught me the kind of teacher and the kind of person that I don't want to be. And that's huge. For me, that is massive. I will never be that person who makes a comment about somebody else's yoga pose. I remember being in a yoga class, and a yoga teacher, when I got into a pose, came up and went, "Wow, what is this?" And I just thought, fuck you. Who the fuck are you to make a comment like that to me? You're supposed to be the person who's guiding me towards better, not making me feel worse about myself. So, yes, love-hate relationship with the practice. Love-hate relationship with the term yoga teacher, because of teachers that I have encountered who either yelled at their students or criticized their students. I couldn't handle it. Maybe it's because Joan was my first encounter with a yoga teacher, and she was the archetype of everything that you would want from a yoga teacher: compassionate and kind and gentle and caring. I've seen a lot of yoga teachers who are not that, and I understand also, seen through a spiritual lens, that they are working through their karma, they are working through their shit, for lack of a better term. And I understand it and I respect it. However, I take what I do as a yoga teacher extremely seriously. And I understand that it is not my role to project my shit onto other people. I wrote in my second book that and I'm paraphrasing my own words, but that there are two kinds of teachers in the world. There are those who want to show you what they can do, and there are those that want to show you what you can do. And that you need to be wary of the former, and you need to be looking for the latter. You need to be looking for the ones who are there to show you what you can do. As any guide, as any spiritual teacher or light bearer, or whatever the hell I do in the world, I take my responsibility very seriously to be the person who holds space for other people, for their healing, for their processes to happen, for their evolution, and for them to just be, for them to just relax and be. I also believe that it is our responsibility as light bearers and guides and teachers to break the cycle of mistrust that people are walking into class with. Most people have been hurt. Most people have been betrayed. Most people have been led to believe that they cannot depend on anyone. And I think that it is our responsibility as these teachers and these guides and these light bearers to accompany these people in a very specific way, and to be the person that they can count on and that they can trust to always hold that space for them. Now, with that said, boundaries have to be put in place. Obviously, we are not, as teachers and light bearers, accessible 24/7. And, we need to get on with our own lives and with our own journey. So, yes, boundaries every now and again have to be put into place. But with that said, what I saw from so many yoga people and so many yoga teachers had me really despising not only the industry of yoga, but the term yoga teacher. And I remember about a year or two ago on social media, I posted a comment saying I'd rather not be known as a yoga teacher. I'm someone who is here to accompany other people. I'm here to walk alongside people who are walking through darkness and walking through grief and walking through, the shadow side of their experience of life. And I almost didn't want to be associated with these people who called themselves yoga teachers and made it about them. Thank God for people like Joan Ravinsky. Thank God for people like Sean Korn. Thank God for people like Richard Miller. Thank God for people like Darby. Thank God for people like Jen Magandance. Thank God for these people, because without them, I would not be where I am. I wouldn't be telling you all of this right now. I wouldn't be recounting my story. Without them, there would be no balance in my experience, in my mind, with the term yoga teacher. Because those 5 names that I read to you, those people who have changed my life, they have shown me that being a yoga teacher can be a calling, and that it can be the most significant and deeply spiritual of callings, and that it has a gravitas to it that needs to be respected, and it has a weight to it that is something that I take so seriously and I take full accountability with, and that I will never abuse. And so I find myself still in this dance with yoga, my relationship to it, how often I practice, how I practice. But what I have noticed is that if I do less of the physical postures, less of the asana, I do way more of the philosophy and the life lessons, because ultimately yoga is a system that guides us towards living a life that is just going to bring more contentment and more love and more satisfaction and more peace, not only to ourselves, but to the world around us and to the environments around us. Thank God for these people who have reminded me throughout my experiences with them that being a yoga teacher is an honor, and that it is a blessing, and that it is a responsibility that I take, and that it's meant to be taken so seriously, with obviously, a sense of humor, but nonetheless seriously, and that it is probably one of the most beautiful vocations that I can be blessed with. I do believe it is a vocation. I believe I've been called to it. I believe I've been initiated into it. And I believe that what I've learned through it and what I pass on from it, I will bring with me to the last breath that this body has. I wanted to share all this with you because I haven't really spoken about my relationship to yoga in these episodes, and I don't really talk about it very often. So I figured, you know what, I'll get it down once. I'll get it down in as much of its entirety as I can, and just leave it at that. So, I hope that there was something in here that resonated with you. I hope that there's something in here that potentially triggered something for you to look at within yourself. And hopefully there was something in all this that is inspiring to you. So, think about it. I'll see you later. This has been the Examine Life with Bram Levinson.